It's the early 1500s, and there's this one man who quietly owns the power to literally shape nations. And his net worth? A staggering 2% of Europe's GDP, around $400 billion in today's money. But he wasn't a king or a noble, he was a banker. Jakob Fugger wasn't just wealthy, he was a kingmaker. He shaped empires and economies. Kings turned to him for loans. Popes depended on his wealth. With the kind of fortune that could have ended poverty, Fugger instead used it to fuel wars and reshape Christianity, changing Europe forever. Jakob Fugger didn't just build wealth, he rewrote the rules of how money worked. Think about it, he'd lend someone cash but hold on to their copper and silver as a guarantee. In modern times, we'd call that asset-backed lending. He then built a mining empire so big that it practically owned Europe's supply of precious metals. Imagine if one person today owned all of the gold mines and lithium supply today. That was essentially Fugger. He even convinced the church to allow charging interest on loans, something that was unthinkable, something that the church had banned for centuries. Now, Fugger also bankrolled the sale of indulgences. These were basically get-out-of-purgatory cards that the church sold for cash. Now, in doing so, Fugger didn't just fund the church's lavish activities, he sparked a revolution. Like I said, Jakob Fugger changed the rules of money and politics forever, but his ambition didn't just appear out of nowhere. The way that he grew up, the hardships that he faced, the learning opportunities that he sought, they all shaped his worldviews. Fugger was born in 1459 in the bustling town of Augsburg, a city known as the financial hub of Germany. Now, life was not easy for Jakob from the start. He was just 10 when his father passed away. His mother decided to send him to Venice to become an apprentice in business. Now, this was a very smart decision because Venice was an international commercial power hub. It was a place rich in culture and knowledge, and while Jakob was there, he absorbed everything he could: business skills, investment strategies, and even political tricks of the time. A few years later, Jakob Fugger returned to Augsburg. There, he witnessed a key moment. The Habsburg Emperor Frederick III himself was present and was desperate for wool and silk. He begged Jakob's brother Ulrich for help. Now, Ulrich agreed, and in return, he received a coat of arms with 3 lilies. That moment lifted the Fugger family into Augsburg's elite. And for Jakob, he had a sudden realization: even kings need money. As time passed, the world entered a new era. Between 1480 and 1560, mining innovations transformed the way gold, silver, and copper were extracted. Demand skyrocketed, and visionaries like Jakob Fugger saw his chance to rewrite the rules of wealth. He left textiles behind and ventured into mining. He built foundries in Austria and expanded his reach across Europe. By that time, he didn't just sell copper, he literally owned the market. I made a video about this, by the way, in case you need more details, so check that out over here. So by the mid-1480s, Jakob Fugger had already proven himself to be a man of vision. And then in 1485, he took over the family agency in Innsbruck. The region was rich in copper and silver. Archduke Sigismund of Tyrol was the owner of these mines. Though he was a high-ranking noble, he was far from being financially stable. Years of lavish spending and poor management drained his treasuries. Sigismund needed money, and he needed it fast. And that's where Jakob saw his chance. He offered Sigismund a lifeline, a loan to help him stay afloat. But Jakob didn't want repayment in cash. Instead, he made a calculated deal. He secured the loans with the deliveries of copper and silver from Tyrol's mine. Now, this was a huge deal back then, and it was kind of groundbreaking as well, because Fugger's use of copper and silver-backed loans weren't just clever, they were groundbreaking, they were innovative for that time. At a time when financial transactions were often informal and very risky, Fugger introduced a system that minimized his exposure to loss. He secured his loans with physical assets like copper and silver, creating an early form of collateralized lending. This meant that even if the borrower defaulted, in this case that would be Sigismund, Fugger could easily recover his investment through valuable metals that he held as security. It was a very bold strategy at the time. It didn't only safeguard his wealth, but also allowed him to exert influence over critical industries like mining. This approach laid the groundwork for modern secured loans, proving that Fugger wasn't just a merchant. He was a financial innovator, shaping how wealth could be protected and grown. Anyway, if Sigismund could not repay his loans, the Fuggers would not lose out. It was a win-win for Fugger because the deal set the tone for how he would approach business going forward. This strategy worked so well that Jakob expanded it almost immediately. By the 1490s, the Fuggers controlled Europe's largest mining empire. Silver mines in Tyrol, copper mines in Hungary and Slovakia. Even the metallurgical processes were in their hands. But the real turning point came when Sigismund faded into the background. His influence was eclipsed by a rising star, Maximilian of Austria. Now, Maximilian was the son of Emperor Frederick III, and he had his eyes set on becoming the Holy Roman Emperor himself. As you know, campaigns like this usually require huge amounts of money. So when Maximilian needed financial backing, who do you think he approached? Fugger stepped in, of course. He gave him a jaw-dropping loan of 800,000 florins, and that's not a small amount, even by today's standards. It was enough to sway the course of the European politics at the time. And this time, Fugger didn't ask for copper or silver as collateral. Instead, he asked for land. And Maximilian, well, he delivered. Maximilian rose to power as King of the Romans in 1486 and later on as the Holy Roman Emperor himself. And Jakob went on from being just a wealthy merchant to now a kingmaker. Now, Maximilian was thinking about his military campaigns, but even before this, Jakob Fugger was already thinking ahead. It was obvious that he would align his financial strategies with the emperor's ambitions, and he did it very well. He used his profits to purchase valuable land as well. When Maximilian needed funding to reclaim Vienna, Fugger stepped in and provided the money that he needed to take back the city. Meanwhile, Maximilian was carving his own path. As the Holy Roman Emperor, he saw the value of humanism and wanted to make sure that his empire was known for it. And Jakob had long benefited from working with Jewish financiers and protecting them, serving his broader economic goals. In 1513, Maximilian did something unexpected. When the city of Frankfurt wanted to expel its Jewish community, he helped them. Jakob defended them, and the city had no choice but to back down. And 1 year later, Maximilian extended protection to all Jewish people in the empire. Sure, it looked like an act of tolerance, but in reality, it was just another example of Jakob's quiet control over the empire's decisions. So Fugger and Maximilian were making history, one that was redefining politics, but also revolutionizing finance. Together, their alliance left an indelible mark on history. So by now, Fugger had left his mark in the world of politics and wealth, but there was one area that he still wanted to take over: the church. In 1514, one of the most influential religious posts in Europe became up for grabs. There was this position called the Archbishop of Mainz, and this was the gateway to political power and wealth. But when this prestigious position became available, it wasn't really a question of qualification or devotion. Rather, it was about who could pay the highest price. Think about it. It was the most powerful position in Germany, second only to the emperor. A member of one of the most influential families in the empire called Albrecht of Hohenzollern desperately wanted the role. I'm sorry for my pronunciation, but there was a huge problem because Albrecht did not have the cash. So he turned to Fugger for a loan. Albrecht knew that Fugger was the only one who could finance such a massive bid, and Fugger was there to help him. For him, this was just another great opportunity. If Albrecht had secured the position, Fugger would have another powerful ally in one of the most critical seats in the empire. Now, this deal would not have worked out without Pope Leo X. Now, Pope Leo was infamous for his reckless spending, and he wanted his share. To give you an idea of what Pope Leo was like, he basically liked spending money on unsavory parties and spent a staggering amount of money on his own coronation. And it just so happens that Pope Leo was the ultimate gatekeeper for Albrecht's ambition. Without Pope Leo's approval, Albrecht could not secure the prestigious position of the Archbishop of Mainz, which, as I told you before, held immense political and religious power in Germany. So Pope Leo knew this, and his approval came at a price of 34,000 florins, which is a staggering sum of money that Albrecht could not afford. It's about $4.8 million in today's money. That's where Fugger stepped in. He sent the payment directly to the Pope's personal bank account. This set off a chain reaction that would go on to shake the very foundations of Christianity. That's where things got even murkier because Albrecht needed a steady flow of cash to repay Fugger's loan. And that's where the selling of indulgences came in, and that became his solution. Essentially, these were get-out-of-purgatory passes that people could buy for themselves or their loved ones, and it was marketed as an act of faith. But in reality, it was a cleverly disguised money-making scheme. It was a brilliant con with a very convenient backstory. The church claimed that the funds were destined for the St. Peter's Basilica, but that was not true. A chunk of that money was heading straight to Fugger's coffers. And to make sure that this scheme reached every corner of Europe, the church needed a salesman, someone who could seal the deal. And they brought in an indulgence peddler, this guy named Johann Tetzel, who was a showman. He carried a chest decorated with a picture of Satan himself and promised worshippers that his indulgences could erase every sin. He even had a progressive fee schedule with 25 florins for royalty and 1 florin for laborers. And the money that was raised, well, that was split right down the middle. Half went to the Pope and the other half went to Fugger. Honestly, it was quite shameless, but it worked. The coins piled up, filling both Fugger's vaults and the Vatican treasury. Now, Fugger didn't just fund the church's indulgences, he also financed its protection. Fugger was controlling the flow of money into Rome. They called him God's banker. You see, he was the Pope's main financial ally, and now he was protecting the Pope from internal and external threats. He even paid Swiss mercenaries to guard him. Basically, he started the tradition of the Swiss Guard that still stands today. The next step of his plan was to challenge a centuries-long tradition. You see, for ages, the church had a simple rule. Charging interest was a sin. Lending money was fine, but profiting from it was pure greed. This was called usury and it could send your soul straight to hell. But Jakob Fugger didn't see it that way. To him, charging interest was not a sin. Instead, it was a service. Loans came with risks. Sometimes borrowers could not pay back the money and lenders lost everything. So why not charge a little extra interest for taking on that risk? But the church was not going to change its stance just because a wealthy banker asked them nicely. I mean, even if he was their main financier. So Fugger knew that he needed a new plan. He didn't simply argue his case in back rooms and private conversations, but instead, he launched a public campaign to challenge the church's centuries-old stance on usury. He funded debates among scholars and the theologians to plant seeds of doubt about whether all interest was truly sinful. He made sure that people talked about it, they questioned and rethought the issue. Then Fugger took his fight straight to the top. He wrote directly to Pope Leo. Fugger's message was bold. According to him, charging interest was not greed or exploitation. Instead, it was fairness and compensating lenders for their risks and efforts. When Fugger made this case, Leo listened. In 1515, Pope Leo issued a groundbreaking decree. Interest was no longer sinful as long as loans involved labor, cost, or risk. Now, this was a very clever loophole because it essentially legalized charging interest because no loans ever come without a level of risk if you think about it. Now, this wasn't just a logical decision on the Pope's behalf, there was a hidden motive behind it. The church needed funds to maintain its power, and Leo had grand ambitions to leave a legacy. His vision was to complete the renovation of Rome's sacred landmarks. This included the construction of the modern St. Peter's Cathedral, the Sistine Chapel, and the sprawling plaza in front of it. And as you can imagine, all of this came with a very hefty price tag. Architects, artists like Michelangelo, and skilled laborers didn't come cheap, and after years of extravagance, Leo's treasury was running empty. And by now we know that whenever popes and kings needed money, they could go to Jakob Fugger, and that's exactly what Pope Leo did. In exchange for loans to the church, Jakob secured a steady income stream and a powerful ally. His funds became the backbone of Pope Leo's renovation plans, and the impact of this was monumental. I mean, you can see it till this day. The breathtaking St. Peter's Basilica, as we know it today, exists because of Fugger's money. Even the Sistine Chapel's iconic ceiling, which was painted by Michelangelo, was made possible by these funds. But financing the Vatican was not a gift, it was a loan, and loans come with repayment plans. Pope Leo X was desperate to keep the wheels turning and turned to an extreme measure to gather funds. He started taxing believers heavily, squeezing resources out of the faithful across Europe. And this included their German citizens, and they were outraged by the idea that their hard-earned money was going to be used for some lavish Roman renovation project that they might never see. And there's one universal truth that still resonates to this day. Nobody likes taxes. But for these German citizens, this was over the top. It pissed off the citizens. This exploitative scheme was a powder keg. It sparked outrage and resentment all across Europe, particularly in Germany. The rising anger across Europe created a perfect backdrop for Fugger's daring moves. His next stop was controlling the papal treasury itself. But to achieve this, Fugger needed to play a political game, and he played it very well. The warrior Pope Julius II was campaigning for the papacy, and Fugger was not going to let this moment pass. He poured 4,000 ducats into Julius's campaign and made sure that the cardinals received generous gifts to sway their vote. And it worked. Julius was elected and Fugger reaped the rewards. As a token of his gratitude, the Pope awarded Fugger the exclusive contract to mint papal currency. From 1508 to 1524, Fugger's company leased the Roman mint, known as the zecca. Over those years, his firm produced 66 types of coins for 4 different popes. Each coin was a symbol of Fugger's growing control over the church's financial machinery. Another move from Fugger involved a secret deal with the Prince Bishop Melchior von Machau. I'm sorry for my pronunciation, but essentially he was a German Roman Catholic cardinal and bishop. The Prince Bishop invested 150,000 florins in Fugger's company in exchange for a 5% annual dividend. Now, this was a very risky business venture because for the church, profiting from interest was forbidden, as you remember. But Fugger didn't care. He was just bending the rules to fit his own ambitions. When the Prince Bishop died in 1509, the secret investment came to light. The Pope, the Bishopric of Brixen, and the Machau family all claimed that money, and they demanded it back immediately. If this came to pass, Jakob Fugger would go bankrupt. But then someone stepped in to save Fugger, and that was Emperor Maximilian I, if you remember from the beginning of the video, because the emperor wanted to save his favorite banker, and it makes sense, he made him a lot of money. Now, Fugger came in with a cunning plan to ensure everything worked out in his favor. He promised to assist Pope Julius II in a war against the Republic of Venice. In return, Emperor Maximilian would be recognized as the legitimate heir to the Prince Bishop's estate. This arrangement didn't just settle the dispute, it further tied Fugger's fortune to both the church and the Habsburg monarchy. I mean, he was outright the most powerful man in Europe, and he commanded no armies or no titles. He only had a lot of money, and he knew how to use it effectively. But then the real fallout began. Remember those sale of indulgences that I talked about earlier, the get out of purgatory passes that the church would sell? Well, that made a lot of money for both the church and Jakob Fugger, but it came with a price that no one really saw coming. A young reformer by the name of Martin Luther was outraged by what he saw. You see, Martin Luther grew up in the silver mines of the Harz Mountains, where his father worked as a master smelter. So he knew all about mining and the influence that families like Fugger's had on it. He was acutely aware of their influence. However, what really set him off was that they used religion to line their pockets. By 1517, the Fuggers were mining silver and copper, and they were knee-deep in the church's indulgence business. To Luther, this was selling salvation for a profit, and it was something that he could not ignore. What happened next was bigger than anyone could have imagined. Luther's words sparked a movement that turned into the Protestant Reformation, and with that, Fugger's reputation began to shift. Fugger's name became synonymous with greed and manipulation. There were rumors about the sources of his wealth, and some even said that the Fuggers had ties to the devil. Honestly, these accusations are not entirely surprising if you think about it. The Fuggers were powerful, secretive, and unapologetic about their influence. To ordinary people, their wealth seems too massive, too vast, and almost otherworldly. Luther's actions were a stand against the greed and the corruption that had taken over. His rebellion caused a massive split in society and sparked a centuries-long religious conflict. But even with all of that, it barely slowed down the rise of capitalism if you think about it. The Fuggers and all of them like him grew only stronger during the chaos of the Reformation. In a way, Luther could be seen as one of the first voices to challenge unchecked wealth and power. But the irony is hard to miss. I mean, centuries later, there's this historian called Max Weber who linked the Protestant ethic to the spirit of capitalism. I mean, if Luther knew, he would probably be rolling in his grave. Now, the pressure on Luther continued to mount as his criticisms of the church began to take on a more confrontational approach. In 1518, Martin Luther found himself face to face with a cardinal who had just arrived from Rome for an intense interrogation. For 3 days, Luther was grilled in Jakob Fugger's grand palace in Augsburg. In this meeting, Luther couldn't ignore the immense power and influence that the Fuggers had over the church, and it weighed heavily on him. But this didn't hold Luther back. He continued to criticize Jakob Fugger and the big banking companies in Augsburg. To him, the Fuggers were the perfect example of everything wrong with the church. The Reformation sparked something even larger. It kicked off the wars of religion, including the brutal 30 Years' War. Europe was in chaos, Protestants and Catholics were at war with each other. Now, it's important to note that Jakob Fugger was not alive to witness these conflicts. The 30 Years' War happened well after, almost a century after he died. But Fugger's financing of the indulgence sales and his role in enabling the church's excesses massively contributed to this growing resentment, and it fueled this Reformation, setting the stage for centuries of religious and political upheaval. The 30 Years' War alone caused the deaths of an estimated 8 million people. Entire regions were left in ruins with widespread famine and disease. The battles tore apart countries and turned families against each other and left a trail of destruction. What started as a religious divide ended up changing Europe forever. Despite his role in fueling conflict for decades and even centuries after he died, Fugger envisioned a future that benefited the less fortunate. It's a weird aspect of his character because for such a money and power-hungry person, philanthropy would be the last thing you'd expect, but it's surprising that one of his most remarkable achievements was a housing project for the poor, also known as the Fuggerei. Back then, charity was both a duty to society and a path for salvation, and Jakob knew this very well. The Fuggerei was built in honor of his late brothers, Ulrich and Georg. By creating the Fuggerei, he was preserving the memory of his brothers and solidifying their legacy as a family that cared for their community. But there might be another reason behind Jakob's generosity. It was faith. He was a devout Catholic, and at that time, Catholics believed in purgatory, a place where souls were purified before entering heaven. Charity, indulgences, and acts of penance were seen as ways to reduce time in purgatory. In many ways, the Fuggerei was a spiritual investment. It was a way for Jakob to ensure the salvation of his soul and those of his family. Jakob's desire to help went beyond business. Alongside his business successes, Jakob felt a strong need to do good. His faith played a pretty big part in it. Jakob Fugger set up an account in his firm for his late brothers. It was in the name of Augsburg's patron saint, Saint Ulrich. He provided 10,000 florins, which guaranteed 500 florins in annual interest for the foundations. Through this arrangement, Saint Ulrich symbolically became a partner in his firm. The idea was pretty simple. By naming a saint as an account holder, Jakob believed that the firm would be blessed with good fortune. Now, the church allowed an interest at a modest 5%, which meant that Jakob could grow his endowment without breaking any rules. Jakob Fugger passed away on December 30th, 1525, and he left behind an enormous fortune and a legacy that would shape the future of his family for generations to come. At the time of his death, the total assets of his company was a jaw-dropping 2 million guilders. It was almost unimaginable the amount of money for that early on in the 16th century. His nephew Anton Fugger stepped into Jakob's shoes and continued the work that he started. Now, Anton had his own chapters to add to the Fugger story, but it was Jakob Fugger's ambition, vision, and determination that built the family empire from the ground up. It's no doubt that Jakob Fugger's legacy as one of the wealthiest people in history still fascinates many people. If you adjust his fortune for inflation, it's estimated to be around $400 billion today. That's about 2% of Europe's GDP back then. This made Fugger one of the richest individuals of his time and one of the wealthiest people to have ever lived. Jakob Fugger was deeply committed to the Catholic faith, especially in a city like Augsburg, where many had turned into Protestantism during the Reformation. They used their influence to support the survival of Catholicism and backed religious orders like the Jesuits. But their reach didn't stop there. The Fuggers extended their influence to nearby regions as well. They lent money to the Dukes of Bavaria and advised them on artistic matters. They also played a key role in bringing the beauty of the Italian Renaissance to the South German courts. By the time the 30 Years' War was on the horizon, the Fuggers had built up a vast network, owning over 100 villages in eastern Swabia. Their power and influence were undeniable. The Fugger family began as merchants, and over time they became nobles. They earned important positions in the church and in the government, and their successes brought them power in trade and politics. Now, let's not sugarcoat it. Fugger's path to greatness was not ordinary. Through shady deals, strategic partnerships, and ambition, he built an empire that could challenge kings and shape history. He knew the hard route he had to take, and he did it without hesitation, even if he had to face rivals like Martin Luther and the threat of rebellion. Fugger never backed down, but his ambition came at a cost. His deals shaped politics and religion, but they also fueled a lot of inequality and unrest. Greed that doesn't stop with wealth, well, it damages nations. It creates division, hardship, and lasting conflict that's exemplified by the war of religion. Fugger's story shows us how unchecked ambition can leave entire societies broken in its wake. If you haven't already, please do subscribe to the channel and also leave a crown emoji in the comments below. Also, if you haven't already, check out this video that I made about Winston Churchill. I think you'll really enjoy it. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.